Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I decided to do a fun video for the Halloween season by coming up with a tier list for the boss monster cards in the One Piece card game. This is for sets 1 through 4 only, up to the current releases that we have in North America. It's not worth the time to argue over what should and should not be considered a boss monster, but I did have to come up with a criteria. So what I came up with is any character that is a 7 cost or higher that is either a super rare or a secret rare. So now that I've provided a cutoff for what I am considering a boss monster for this list, let me go over the tiers. At the top we have Absolute Nightmare or S tier. These cards are cards that will make you want to scoop if your opponent sees them back to back, because they are likely winning if they do see them back to back. And this category is reserved for the most broken boss monster cards. Next I have Terrifying or A tier cards. These boss monster cards are cards that you have to carefully game plan around, or cards that you expect to see that provide a huge momentum swing in a game. The cards in this category can feel broken if they are played correctly. After that I have the Scary or B tier. Most of the cards will fall under this category as they can all be difficult to deal with, but the Scary tier is mostly reserved for the boss monsters with various effects that help execute the strategies of their respective decks. These cards can help reach the win condition, but don't necessarily win a game outright on their own, with a few exceptions if your opponents don't have answers to them. The next tier is the Flinching or C tier. I had to come up with a title that fit the next tier break, so I figured Flinching is appropriate because the cards in this category may make you flinch if played at the right time in the right matchup, but they just aren't universally threatening to every deck out there. Lastly, I have the Harmless or D tier. These are boss monsters that just don't see much play at all, or they have effects that are just outclassed in the decks that they normally belong in. So those are the categories I've come up with. Let's just jump right into ranking these boss monsters. The first card that I will be putting in S tier should come as no surprise. It is the only card that is restricted to 1 on this list, and that is the 9-drop Edward Newgate. He has 10,000 power and an on-play ability. Up to one of your leader gains plus 2,000 power until the start of your next turn. Then you cannot add life cards to your hand using your own effects during this turn. And his secondary effect, Dawn times 2, when attacking, KO up to one of your opponent's characters with 3,000 power or less. So this is an absolute nightmare in the Whitebeard deck because you don't take life with your leader ability, and it gives you plus 2,000, so your opponent has to swing over 8,000. And with so many counters in that deck, it's hard for them to overcome, especially if you play this back to back. And it's also good in other red decks as well because it gives you plus 2,000, they have to swing over 7, and it's just a really good card to have for the end game because it makes your opponent have to swing more in order to take your last life, and it gives you a big body on board. The next card in the S tier is another card that should come as no surprise. It is the 10-drop Charlotte Linlin. She has 12,000 power, and on play, if your leader has the Big Mom Pirates type, add up to 1 card from the top of your deck to the top of your life cards, then trash up to 1 card from the top of your opponent's life cards. So this is basically a 2-life swing, and if your opponent sees it back to back, then it is just such a menace. And I've been on the other side of multiple 10-drop plays back to back, and it's not fun. It's definitely a card that makes you want to scoop toward the end. But yeah, another card that I've heard some people want restricted down to 1, and I could see the argument. It is a really powerful card, but that is actually the only 2 cards that I would put in the Absolute Nightmare tier. These are cards that just can't be played around, and they are really destructive if they are played back to back. The first card that I am putting in the A tier, or the Terrifying tier, is the new 10-drop Doflamingo. He has 10,000 power, and on play, up to a total of 3 of your opponent's rested leader and character cards will not become active in your opponent's next refresh phase. So my experience with this card so far, it is a card that is arguably an S tier card, but the only reason that I do not have it in the S tier is because it is a card that you can play around. Unlike the 9-drop Edward Newgate and the 10-drop Charlotte Linlin, This card, you can choose to leave your characters active, or you can play cards that restand. There is the Leader Kid that restands, there's the Leader Lucci that restands, and there are just other cards that can get around this card, especially green cards like Basil Hawkins. So because this card can be played around a little bit, I have him at the top of the A tier, but still a really powerful card. Definitely terrifying. The next card that I'll be putting in the A tier is the 9-drop Jackal Mihawk. He has 9,000 power and on play, place up to one character with a cost of 7 or less to the bottom of the owner's deck. So this is just really consistent, really solid. It is a momentum swing for you. You get to get rid of a big body from your opponent's side of the board, and you get to play a big body yourself. So this is just a really strong card. It has gone up in price, and in most blue decks, this is a staple that you usually play 4 of, but I believe that this is absolutely a terrifying card. It's just really solid. Like I said, there aren't really too many drawbacks to this card. This next card might be controversial, but I actually have the 10-drop Kaido, the purple one from the first set. It has 12,000 power, and on play, Don -6. If your leader has the Animal Kingdom Pirates type, KO all characters other than this character. So this card, it doesn't see much play because you don't see many Animal Kingdom Pirate leaders, but the reason I have it in Terrifying is because it's absolutely a card. Anytime you see an Animal Kingdom Pirates leader, you have to account for this card. It's a card that you have to play around, and if they ramp and see this card on turn 4 or even turn 3 potentially, then it's a body that just sticks on the board and it's a 12k, and that is definitely terrifying. Standalone, this is a really terrifying card for sure. Kicking off the B tier, I have the 8-drop Katakuri. He has 8,000 power and on play, add up to one character with a cost of 8 or less to the top or bottom of the owner's life cards face up. So this is a card that is seeing more play now than it did in set 3, especially at a max count or at least 3 of, because he just deals with so many troublesome cards that your opponent might play. But this is a versatile card. It allows you to potentially add life to yourself. So if you have like a Shirahoshi in play, he can put a Shirahoshi back in life and you get to draw more cards, so that's always good. And it's a solid card, but it definitely plays second fiddle to the 10-drop Big Mom. But you play this card on curve and put your opponent's character to the top of their life, and then on your 10-Don turn, you play the 10-drop Linlin, then you get to trash that card. So yeah, it allows you to pull off some pretty cool plays, and it's definitely a scary card. The next card that I have in B tier is the new Monkey D. Luffy. It's the 7-drop Dressrosa. It has 7,000 power, and this character can also attack active characters, so that's really good. And it has the ability Activate Main once per turn. You may return 7 cards from your trash to the bottom of your deck in any order. Then set this character as active, and this character will not become active in your next refresh phase. So this is actually a really scary card, and I think it's a card that could rise into the ranks of Terrifying. But right now, I think it's best used in the Dressrosa deck with Rebecca, because he can essentially gain rush with the stage and Rebecca as the leader and attack your opponent's active characters. It doesn't have rush to attack your opponent's leader, but attacking active characters is really good. And just having the ability to close out a game with this card, it's a character with double swing. The only reason I have it in Scary actually is because it is a 7 cost, so it can be bot decked before you get to use it with like a Mihawk, or it can be removed from play with Katakuri. So there are a lot of options to remove this card before you get use out of it. So right now I have it toward the top of Scary. The next card that I have in the B tier is the 7-drop Porcus D Ace. He has 7,000 power, and on play, give up to 2 of your opponent's characters minus 3,000 power during this turn. Then, if your leader type includes Whitebeard Pirates, this character gains rush during this turn. So, 2 really good effects there to be able to give 2 of your opponent's characters minus 3,000. It's good for board control, and if you are playing a Whitebeard Pirates leader, then he does gain Rush, so Rush is always good, especially with a 7k attacker. This probably isn't a character that too many people think of as a boss monster, but I think it definitely deserves to be this high in the scary tier because it's just giving respect to the Edward Newgate deck. This card is a pivotal card in that deck, and I definitely think it at least belongs at the top of scary. Next up, we have another new card from set 4, Kingdoms of Intrigue. It is the blue 10-drop Kaido. He has 12,000 power, and on play, return up to one character with a cost of 8 or less, and up to one character with a cost of 3 or less to the owner's hand. So this is a really powerful card. It's bounce instead of bot deck, so that's kind of a bit of a drawback because bouncing is never going to be as good as hard removal, but being able to remove an 8 cost from the board is still pretty good. And it also is versatile because you can actually bounce your own characters back to your hand, so you can play cards like Kaya, get her effect to draw 2 cards and trash 2 cards to filter your hand, and then later on in the game you can put that card back to your hand. So yeah, this card is pretty versatile. The reason I probably have it a little bit lower than other people might is because there are better plays to make at your 10-drop turn. Like most of the time I would actually rather play the 9-drop Mihawk to just hard remove a character from play. But yeah, it's a really scary card for sure, especially if this sticks on board. It is of course a 12k swing. Next up is another new card from Kingdoms of Intrigue, and that is the 9-drop Yamato. They have 9,000 power, and on play, KO up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost equal to or less than the total of you and your opponent's life cards. Then, if you have 1 or less life cards, add up to 1 card from the top of your deck to the top of your life cards. So this card is really good in Queen to kind of drag the game out and do Queen things, but yeah, yellow doesn't have enough removal, so I think having access to removal for some low-cost blockers is always going to be really good for yellow. And yeah, just adding life, that's also just a really strong effect, and it's a 9k body on board. So this is a card that could rise in future sets with the announcement of the Wano leaders in the yellow color. So yeah, definitely a card that is really solid, and I think it's a scary card in yellow. Sticking with yellow, we have the 7-drop Charlotte Linlin up next. She has 8,000 power, and on play your opponent gets to choose, trash 1 card from the top of your opponent's life cards, or add 1 card from the top of your deck to the top of your life cards. So it's another card that can swing life, but it gives your opponent the choice, so it is a card that I've seen being played a little bit less, but I think that it's a pretty strong card, especially if you play it on curve. It is an 8,000 attacker, and yeah, it's definitely a scary card, but a card that can be dealt with. It is a 7 cost, so you know, it's another card that has to deal with Mihawk. I like this card a lot more than some, but I could see this being cut down just because yellow has so many boss monster cards and this doesn't have any counters, so there are just other options, but it's still a scary card to see. Up next, I have the 9-cost Kaido from the purple starter deck. He has 10,000 power, and on play, Dawn -5, KO one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 6 or less. Then this character gains Rush during this turn. Definitely a really strong card for Animal Kingdom Pirates, and having Rush on a 10k body is nice. Dawn -5 is kind of a lot, but if you have ramp in place, then this actually isn't too bad. You can see this earlier in the game because you are ramping to it. So if you can get this card out there earlier than you should, it's a scary card, and one that I actually expect to rise a little bit in popularity with some of the new purple leaders coming out. So this is a card that can rise, and it's a card I've always been a fan of. The next card that I will put in the scary tier is actually the secret rare Soga King. He's a 7 cost with 6,000 power, and this is the first boss monster that actually has a 1k counter, so that's kind of nice. And you also treat this card as Usopp for some reason, and on play return up to 1 character with a cost of 6 or less to the owner's hand, then draw 2 cards and trash 2 cards from your hand. This is just a solid card. It doesn't have too many drawbacks. The 6,000 power is kind of underwhelming, but It's a scary card because it does have the ability to bounce, and it being able to filter cards and your opponent being able to get to the cards that they need more efficiently is always nice. But yeah, it's just a card that can help blue get going, and this card does replace the 7-drop Dofi that we'll be talking about later, so I definitely think that Sobu King belongs in the middle of this tier. So the next card is actually a card that I was really excited for when it came out. It has really strong effects, and that is the 10-drop Kuzan. He has 10,000 power, and on your turn, give all your opponent's characters -5 to their cost. And then he also has an on-play ability, KO up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 0. So his first effect does take into account before the second effect. So you are instantly KOing a 5-cost or less when this card comes into play. And if you drop 2 of these back to back, you're getting rid of any card in the game. So that's really nice. The only problem with this card is that I find it awkward to play this card out of all the 10 drops, because sometimes there are just better plays to make. Like you can drop the 6-drop Sakazuki and have flexibility with your Dawn to play a blocker or just get bigger swings onto the board. And also this card is not searchable. It is former Navy, so you aren't able to search it out with brand new. But this is a card that I've been seeing to great success in Rebecca, so maybe I do have this card too low. But it's not a must play at your 10 Dawn turn like some of the other 10 drops are. The blue 10 drop Kaido being another exception, but it's a strong card and it could definitely rise up. I don't think it's ever going to get a searcher. Like, I don't think we're going to get a former Navy searcher, unfortunately, so I'm not really a big fan of his type, but it's a card I'm a fan of and it looks great. And Kuzan is one of my favorite characters. So sticking with the boss monsters in the black color, the next card that I'm putting on the tier list is the 8-drop Isho. He has 9,000 power and the ability Dawn ×1. During your turn, give all your opponent's characters -3 to their cost. And on play, if your opponent has 6 or more cards in their hand, trash 2 cards from your opponent's hand. So the second effect is really nice, especially if you're going up against Edward Newgate, but other decks can kind of play around this effect because they can just counter out. But the first ability to give all your opponent's characters -3 to their cost is something that you can combo with other cards to kind of control your opponent's board. I go back and forth between this and Kuzan, but I lean Kuzan just slightly. The argument for Isho over Kuzan is that it is searchable because it does have the Navy type. But yeah, Isho is definitely a solid card, and it's a scary card that your opponent has to take into consideration before you get to your 8 Dawn turn, because they don't want to randomly trash 2 cards from their hand. So yeah, Isho, definitely a solid card. So I actually posed the question to my local community what their favorite boss monster card is, and this next card is my favorite boss monster just because I have so much history with this card for the One Piece card game, and that is the 8-drop Eustace Captain Kidd. He has 8,000 power and Dawn ×1 on your opponent's turn. If this character is rested, your opponent cannot attack any characters other than Eustace Captain Kidd. So this is a really strong card because they cannot attack anything else until they deal with this card. And it does have a secondary effect, activate main once per turn. You may rest this character, play one character with a cost of 3 or less from your hand. This card actually would have been in S tier in set 1, and arguably in other sets it would have been higher. But now there are just so many ways to deal with this card, whether it's Otama Pistol or Gordon Fire Fist for red, or Red Rock for blue. You also have the Katakuri for yellow, and black can reduce its cost and remove it from play as well. So yeah, there are just a lot of ways to deal with this card now, but if they aren't prepared for it, this is an absolute nightmare. I still think this is probably too low. I'm just trying not to be biased here, but it's a scary card still, especially if your opponent doesn't have an answer. But yeah, we all know that 8-drop Kid isn't the threat that it used to be, unfortunately, but it's still a card that I enjoy and definitely still scary. Sticking with green, the next card is the 8-drop Kazuki Odin. He has 8,000 power and activate main once per turn. You may rest 3 Dawn and set this character as active. And it also has the ability on KO, play up to 1 green Land of Wano type character with a cost of 3 from your deck, then shuffle your deck. So this card is really scary because it provides a lot of offense. It is a card that can actually get around the 10-drop Doflamingo because he has the restand ability, so you'll at least get 1 swing out of him. The problem with this card is there aren't too many amazing Land of Wano type leaders. Like, you can play this card in Kinemon for value at 7 Dawn, and it's pretty nice in there, but that deck has always kind of underwhelmed, and the Kazuki Odin has never really been too relevant either. So this card in particular has so much offense and it is scary. I guess the best way to put it is the leaders that would typically play this, you'd want to see your opponent playing those decks, but you don't necessarily want to see this card because it is a scary card. The last boss monster that I'll be talking about in this tier is the 8-cross Crocodile from set 4. He has 9,000 power and on play, Dawn -2. If your leader's type includes Baroque Works, add up to 1 card from the top of your deck to the top of your life cards. And he also has a secondary effect on your opponent's attack. Once per turn, Dawn -1, draw 1 card and trash 1 card from your hand. So admittedly, I don't have too much experience with this card, but I have seen it played in the blue-purple Crocodile, and it seems pretty strong. It has the effect to add life, kind of like the cards in yellow. So that's always nice, but yeah, it's an interesting card, one that I want a little bit more experience with, but right now I'll put it at the end of scary. It's a card that is kind of specific to a Baroque Work type's leader, but we have plenty of those, so yeah, interesting card, and I think it's pretty scary. Kicking off the flinching tier is the new 8-drop Don Quixote Rocinante. He has 8,000 power, and on your opponent's turn, if this character is rested, your active characters with a base cost of 5 cannot be KO'd by effects. So that's pretty good to protect your board. And he also has an on-play ability. You may rest this character, play up to 1 green character with a cost of 5 from your hand. So I think that this is another interesting card, and another one that I don't have too much experience with. It's one that I want to play around with a little bit because I am a fan of green decks, but it's a really solid card. I just think that right now it's not really a card that you're going to see too much of. It's not going to be represented too much, but when we get the Don Quixote Pirates Searcher card, I do think that this card will see more play. But yeah, maybe in Isho, because it is also Navy, this card can be pretty strong. So yeah, I think that right now this is a card that belongs at the top of this tier just because it might have its uses, but until it gets that Searcher, I think that right now it's not a card to be worried about too much. Another green boss monster card that I actually do like quite a bit is the 7-cost Eustace Captain Kidd from the starter deck. This is a blocker, and Dawn ×1, end of your turn, set this card as active. So you're able to attack with this card, and if you have a Dawn under him, he gets to restand going into your opponent's turn to be able to use him as a blocker. So that in itself is really solid. Being a 7-cost, there are a lot of ways to remove it, like all the others, but it's a card that I'm actually really interested in trying out at the moment just because of the 10-drop Doflamingo. I think any card that can restand is really good, and yeah, it's a solid card. You know, it could be scary, but until it sees more play, I think that it belongs in this tier. This next card is the secret rare Shanks, and I think that a lot of people might think that I have this too low. It's a 9-cost with 10,000 power, and it does have Rush, so that's really good. And when attacking, your opponent cannot activate a blocker character that costs 2,000 power or less during this battle. So the reason I have this card down here is because I think that the 5-drop Luffy from the starter deck just does everything better. The only thing I could say for this card is being a 10,000 power, it's a card that's likely to stick around more often than that Luffy, but the Luffy can go through any blocker, and if you tuck the same amount of Dawn that you would to play this card, then I don't see any reason why you would play this card over that. But you can play them both in the deck, and then it gets pretty scary, you know, because you have so many options to be able to play powerful rush character cards. But I don't know, every time I try to put this card into a deck, I reach the same conclusion and I end up taking him out. Usually too, red decks are faster, and by the time you get up to the Dawn that you would play this, you would rather put your Dawn on other characters to swing out to close the game, rather than to invest everything into this one attack. You kind of want to spread it around, so that's the other argument against this card, but that's just my opinion. Next up in this tier, I have the 7-cost King. He has 7,000 power, and on play, Dawn -2, KO one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 3 or less, and one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 2 or less. So this is actually a really powerful card, but it's really matchup dependent, because otherwise it can kind of be a dead card in your hand. Being able to remove 2 bodies is really good if you're facing Law, or potentially if you're facing Zoro. It's a card that I do like, but you probably play a couple copies of it, and Dawn -2 is a little bit steep as well. So yeah, strong card, but really matchup dependent. The next card is kind of similar to the King that I just discussed, and it is the 9-cost Shanks from the black starter deck, and he has 10,000 power, and on play you may trash 1 card from your hand and KO all characters with a cost of 1 or less. So you have to wait until the end of the game to kind of play this card, since it's kind of expensive to play, and at that point I don't think it's really amazing to KO characters with a cost of 1 or less. If you do play Isho before you play this card, then I could see you getting use out of it because you're KOing 4 costs on the board, but it is another black card where you have to trash cards from your hand in order to get the removal effect. So overall, it's a solid card, but I'm not too big of a fan of it, and not a card that I expect to see too much of. The next boss monster is the 7-drop Emporia Ivankov, and they have 7,000 power. And on play, draw cards so that you have 3 cards in your hand, and then play up to 1 blue Impel Down type character card with a cost of 6 or less from your hand. So it's a card that can cheat out bodies, but the drawback to this card is you just don't see the Impel Down engine played that much. There are just better engines out there, such as Centimaro Pacifista or the Animal Kingdom Pirates engine now. So it's a strong card for Impel Down decks, but it's just Impel Down decks at the moment are not played. So this is a card, though, if you're going up against those decks, that is really scary, but because you don't see those decks, I would have to put it down in the flinching tier. Next up is another 7-cost blue boss monster, and that is the Don Quixote do Flamingo from the starter deck. He has 7,000 power, and on play, return up to 1 character with a cost of 7 or less to the owner's hand. So this is the card that I said Soga King replaced. It doesn't have a counter. It has plus 1,000 power more than the Soga King, and it does bounce 1 cost higher, but the Soga King being able to filter your hand and dig into your deck a little bit to get to the cards you need, it just makes this card a little bit obsolete. There are certain situations where this card is possibly better, but I don't think that you're going to see too many decks playing this card over the Soga King. So yeah, I think that, you know, if your opponent does play it, it's still strong, but you're just not going to see it as much with the Soga King around. Sticking with the theme of 7-drop blue boss monster cards, the next one is the 7-cost Crocodile. He has 7,000 power, and it's another boss monster that does have a 1,000 counter, so that is nice. And this card has Banish, and that means if your opponent takes the hit with their life, they have to trash it instead of it going to their hand, so that's pretty good. And it has the ability Dawn ×1, give blue events in your hand -1 cost. So this is an interesting card for the utility. I do think Banish is a little underrated right now, but this card, there's just too many better options to play than this card at the moment. Like the rest of the cards in this tier, you just don't see this card played very often. So yeah, but the Vanish is interesting. I think it would be pretty solid in an all yellow meta. So yeah, solid card, just not played. The last card in this tier is the 8-cost Douglas Bullet from the Film Starter deck. He has 10,000 power and activate main once per turn, Don -4. You may rest up to 2 of your opponent's characters with a cost of 6 or less. Then this character gains double attack during this turn. So this is a card I've tried to get to work so many times. I think it's really strong. The value on this card is pretty good because the 10,000 power for an 8 cost is actually really good stats wise. And being able to rest 2 of your opponent's characters with the cost of 6 or less and then gain double attack, that is something that really appeals to me. But for whatever reason, this card is just always kind of underwhelming. There are just better cards to play, and I don't think too many people have really gotten this card to work, but I do think that this is a strong card. It's just, you know, the opportunity to play it would be in the new green-purple Doflamingo deck, but this card is just outshined by the 10-drop Doflamingo himself, and also the 7-drop Luffy from the film deck. So, yeah, I think that this card has potential, but until it sees play, I don't think it's a card you should be worried about. So there are 3 cards left to talk about, and they all belong in the harmless tier. The first one I'll mention is the 7-cost Kazuki Odin from the Yamato starter deck. He has 7,000 power, and on ×1 this character gains double attack. And on KO, you may trash 2 cards from your hand, add up to 1 card from the top of your deck to the top of your life cards. So it's a card that your opponent can kind of just decide not to attack, so you won't get the on KO effect. And the double attack is nice, but there are just better cards to play in yellow for your top end. So this is a card that could possibly see play in the future with some of the new yellow Wano leaders that we're going to get. But right now, it's just not a card that I would expect to see at all. The next card is the 8-drop Uta from set 2. It is the secret rare. She has 8,000 power, and on play, Don -2. Your leader and all of your characters gain plus 1,000 power until the start of your next turn. So that's actually pretty good to be able to give all your characters and your leaders plus 1,000 power. It just makes your characters a little bit more difficult to swing over, but like Douglas Bullet, it's just another card that has better options in the deck that you would probably play this card. I do think it's interesting, but I don't anticipate this card really ever seeing play. But yeah, it's because you won't probably see it. I don't think that it's a card that you should be worried about at all. And lastly, we have the 7-drop Vivi, the secret rare from the new set, Kingdoms of Intrigue. And she does have a plus 1,000 counter, so that is nice. And all of your red characters with the cost of 3 or more other than this character gain rush. So this is a card that you have to establish on board first before you can really make use of her ability. And she only has 4,000 power, so it's really underwhelming stats wise, and it fits the criteria that I came up with for this tier list, but I don't think anyone would really consider this a boss monster card, so I had to put it at the end of the tier list. And on top of all that, it's really not seeing much play at the moment, but all the Vivi cards are really nice looking, I will say that. So yeah, but not really a boss monster card, so yeah, she belongs at the very bottom of this tier list. So that is my tier list. That is what I have come up with. And I did collaborate with a few people to kind of get a little bit more accurate rankings here. Mine was very similar to this, but there were a couple of opinions that switched around a few cards, especially in B tier. I think that was the hardest one to kind of put into order, but I'd love to know what you guys would put in your tier list, what you agree with, what you disagree with. I will link this tier list in the description below. It is one that I made myself, so yeah. But that's how I rank the boss monsters, and it's just a fun little video that I wanted to do for the Halloween season, you know, going over the boss monsters for the One Piece card game. And it's just a more unique topic than your standard tier list for decks. So, but yeah, that's all I have for this one. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and consider subscribing for more One Piece card game content. And I'll see you all in the next video.